I've really enjoyed attending some of these lunchtime webinars, and I'm really happy to be able to be here and share what I feel is important information with you guys. And I will plan on taking a few moments at the end to answer any questions, and my contact information should be available as well. So if there are questions I'm unable to answer for whatever reason today, please feel free to reach out. Okay, but today I would like to talk about ensuring supplier social responsibility. And more specifically, I really would like to kind of leave today with basically these 4 primary points. I would like to introduce those unfamiliar with the triple bottom line and really the benefits surrounding ensuring social responsibility. I want us to be able to understand the supplier's role, more specifically regarding social responsibility within the supply chain. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the primary applicable standards and guidelines that we use to evaluate SR on site. And then finally, I really want to talk about the process of evaluating those suppliers effectively, and then also continuing through with that continuous improvement component. So getting started, this is really the ASQ definition, and I thank the social responsibility technical community for actually developing this and putting the body of knowledge out there. A group of individuals spent a lot of time on kind of capturing this information. So the definition really is social responsibility is a means of achieving sustainability, and adopting key social responsibility principles such as accounting and transparency can help ensure the long-term viability and success of any organization or system. And standards you're going to recognize here that we talk about a little bit later within the triple quality bottom line would incorporate the management, the 9001, the 14001 environment component, and then we're bringing in something we will highlight in a few moments, which is the ISO 26000 guideline, which focuses more on the society component. So we'll go through those. But really we're moving, what you can see here is we're moving from, and I actually frequently compare it to Milton Friedman saying the primary objective of an organization is to create a profit. And then later really this triple bottom line came into play and said, you know, there is more involved into it, and let's look at this all-encompassing, incorporating management, environment, and society to achieve long-term sustainability. Coming from a kind of a marketing background, it's always said we need to focus on the benefits, not the features. So I do want to spend just a couple of minutes just kind of talking about the benefits outside of course, social responsibility makes us feel good, but there are very tangible benefits associated with that that make a strong business case for ensuring social responsibility. So this is just one of so many that demonstrates both the tangible and intangible benefits of incorporating it into your long-term strategy. And this one says, of course, 88% of consumers said they were more likely to buy from a company that supports and engages in activities that improve society. And another one is the cone case evolution study. And what's interesting to this one is they did a follow-up study for this in 2015. And in that study, it was discovered that 90% of those surveyed communicated they're more likely to trust the company and 88% to be more loyal. So when given the choice between 2 products with similar pricing, the follow-up 2015 study here said 90% would switch to the brand with the better SR perception. So of course, you know, that's very interesting. Additional benefits, something I like to incorporate would be stakeholder theory, and that's supporting a host of benefits that include effects related to our employees, suppliers, customers, etc. As an example of that, an organization demonstrating social responsibility is likely to have increased retention and more competitive recruiting of top talent. From a financial standpoint, almost 94% of analyzed studies found a non-negative correlation between corporate social responsibility and corporate financial performance. And that study reference shows that $1 out of every $9 in U.S. assets within the 2012 study that were under professional management were invested in some form of sustainable investment, and that's since been growing. So I think the benefits, are certainly a case for developing social responsibility. However, as we'll see kind of moving through, dealing with major retailers or industries, it really is no longer something, voluntary. If we want to do business with these industries or organizations, we have to incorporate this into our strategy. So before we got going, I kind of wanted to take us back because I think that a solid understanding of history helps us understand where we are today. And of course, the history goes far back beyond 96, even more towards the Declaration of Human Rights. I believe that was 45. But fast forward to that, I think in speaking with people, where I start seeing people's awareness and where my own was drawn attention to SR was back in 96. Was when we saw the video images of the children making the Kathie Lee Gifford clothing line for Walmart. And they called Kathie Lee Gifford to Senate, and that her famous quote really is, we're now morally compelled to ask, what can we do to protect labor rights in factories around the world? So it kind of became highlighted, and as a result of that, Social Accountability International, which is out of DC, developed really the first auditable standard to that respect, which we'll discuss in a couple of minutes as well. But that was SA8000. Moving forward from then, a host of different factory fires. Textile industry has generated not a great stellar reputation in this regard. But this one was a big one, the fire in Bangladesh, and that killed hundreds of workers that produced textiles for top name global companies like The Gap. And there they found the primary emergency exits were blocked, no fire extinguishers were available, they were working 74 to 90 hours a week, paid very little, and then they were also ultimately charged with exploitation of child labor in that respect. Fast forward, I find when I speak to maybe kind of younger individuals, millennials, recognize the Foxconn debacle, where we had, I believe it was 18 or maybe more employees that had jumped off the building committing suicide, which highlighted a lot of issues related to social responsibility within that contract manufacturer. Apple, of course, was really highlighted as one of their primary clients. And as a result, they really have helped develop the Fair Labor Association and have conducted hundreds of audits. Their social responsibility report is actually one of the most comprehensive, and you can find theirs or others if you're interested in any of the public companies. Generally do release information and they post it on their website in addition to any investor reports. So 2010, ISO comes out. They did try to create a standard, but were ultimately unable to do that. So as we will talk about later, we do have the 26,000 guideline, and our focus there is really on that triple bottom line that we had talked about in the beginning. But we will talk about the various elements of that guideline as well. 2013, one of the largest garment factory issues, again, in Bangladesh. And more recently, many of you probably saw Nestle, and that was in terms of the fishing industry in Thailand. And that was actually a huge investigative report that shed light on slavery within that supply chain. So not only is it something where you say, oh, well, that's a terrible thing to happen, financial loss, impact to long-term sustainability, et cetera, have very tangible impacts on the organization that this is occurring with. And just to go back here to demonstrate, I forgot to add one thing. I would recommend, in terms of the benefits or history, how it applies to different industries. I used to enjoy, it was called Pathways to Social Responsibility. And if you Google it, they were these little pamphlets that ASQ would distribute. And they had case studies of various companies or in different industries and how they applied and the benefits that they saw as a result of implementing various SR initiatives. So that was called Pathways to Social Responsibility. You can find them Googling them. Okay, so just getting started with the standards. SA8000, again, was developed by Social Accountability International. It was one of the first, and in fact, the reason why I started working with the company I work with today is the opportunity to work on the marketing plan related to this standard. So it is something that I've really seen develop. And it's something that I think has made a pretty big impact on the way supply chain works. So the primary areas of SA8000 start with child labor. We're asking ourselves, are suppliers following labor laws? It should be noted, of course, that not all child labor is forced labor. We even have cases where employees are submitting false paperwork, the employer isn't doing a good job with verification, etc. So if I were to look at an audit checklist, for example, I might ask, are ages of all employees checked prior to hiring? My evidence to check there might be selecting 5 employees at each workshop, recording their ID, asking them their age, year of birth, date of hire. We've asked them if their employer asked for age identification at the time of their hiring, and then really we're cross-checking that employee information with HR records. Health and safety is a big one. That's one of the first factories I actually had the opportunity to visit. There was a big situation with health and safety where in Taiwan they were making these mid-quality writing instruments. Went into the factory to do one of the first social audits we had performed, dirt floors, and just really rows and rows of individuals putting together these pens. And it really was quite a toxic environment because we had discovered there was no ventilation in this facility. So we were able to spend very little time in there, due to the fumes and headaches and everything else. So as a result of the social audit in that case, we actually did help them put in some ventilation and improve the conditions there. But that was certainly something related to health and safety. And if I was to go back and look at maybe an audit checklist of something related to health and safety, I might say, does the facility record or track accidents? And in this case, I guess the auditor would be looking for some type of tracking sheet or log. And of course, we're doing various interviewing of workers. So kind of disciplinary actions, kind of moving on for that one. I'll have a photo I'll show you later. But we had identified some, for example, latch locks at a supplier that I'd recently visited in China maybe 2 years ago. They were making over 1 million pressure cooking devices at this facility, very high tech, very nice. But the facility was insistent that we not see the dormitory areas. And they had claimed that they were owned by another individual, they were managed by another company, and that they would not be a part of the audit. But we did insist, and it was a part of the audit, and our client represented a substantial amount of business to this organization, to this factory. And it was later we found, and I'll show you the photo, but they had locks really on the outside of the dormitories. So, and they would never say why or how, but I did hear from our auditors and others that it was kind of a common practice as disciplinary. You would kind of lock someone into that dormitory, which to many of us seems, astounding, I guess, but, it is something that happens not only in developing markets, but I've learned in our own as well. So anyways, because our client had represented such a large amount of business, they were forced to remove those locks, whether or not they were currently in use or not. But it was something, that shouldn't have been there. Also, working hours are among the most common issue I see, with the exception of fire extinguisher concerns. In some cases, supplier doesn't have correct paperwork to demonstrate working hours, or that can be manipulated in many creative ways. Your seasoned auditors can identify those very quickly. An example from the auditor checklist here might include something like checking policies related to tardiness, absences, stealing, disruptive production. The evidence to check there being interviewing the HR manager, reviewing applicable policy and procedures. So regarding wages, verifying the last 12 months of pay for at least 5 employees is generally one way to confirm wages, provided are at least the minimum for that area. And of course, the management system is a recurrent theme in the specs and the guidelines. It provides this broad scope and really consistent way of evaluating the other items. And you can get a copy of the standard online. Here's one link for the guidance document. So what SA8000 does offer is this social fingerprint. This is the product that they sell. I believe last time I had checked, I think they charged something like $300 for this, but it allows the self-assessment component of the standard. A lot of the information they do provide free of charge, so you can follow that link there. The cost of certification to this standard does depend on the size, scope, location of the organization. It would vary depending on the number of days or auditors needed to conduct it. General cost, of course, I had looked up last time I saw, was about $300 for this self-assessment. And then they do encourage you to go outside. They partner with various companies that can kind of help you go in and do that final assessment. And I do believe it's a 3-year renewal for that certification. I don't personally work with many organizations that are certified to this standard. However, we work with a lot of organizations that request we either incorporate elements of it into a standard 9001 based or an initial supply review audit. You might put components of it in there. So even if you don't want to go towards a certification, certainly there are elements you can incorporate into your existing system. Moving on to the ISO suite of standards, we recognize 9001 and 14001. Of course, I mentioned those earlier when we were talking about the triple bottom line. 26000 was developed as kind of this holistic approach, you can see. It's all based off of sustainability. It's not a standard, it's a guideline. I did mention that. One additional ISO I didn't mention that is applicable to SR for ISO is 3710. And that's actually related to sustainable development in communities. But for 26000, the focus really is on this 9001, 14001. There are 7 elements to the guideline that you can see here. And according to ISO, quote unquote, an organization should review all the core subjects to identify which issues are relevant. The identification of relevant issues should be followed by an assessment of the significance of the organization's impacts. And the significance of an impact should be considered with reference both to the stakeholders concerned and to the way in which the impact affects sustainable development. So you'll see some elements from F8000, but it, of course, does go above and beyond to incorporate that environmental approach as well. And they've got some great information as well on the ISO site, and I do as well. If you want to email me, we can talk further about that. Where I see big movement in the SR realm is really within the vendor-specific requirements. So what I've seen in my really 19 years of helping people work with their suppliers abroad is that now individuals working with certain retailers, primarily led by Walmart, but now so many others, if you want to do business with them, you're going to follow their vendor-specific responsible sourcing requirements. Walmart kind of talks a lot about responsible sourcing, but that was defined by the International Chamber of Commerce as a voluntary commitment by companies to take into account social and environmental considerations when managing their relationships with suppliers. And in addition to that, I would add, I've seen a lot more integration of security components as well. If anyone's familiar with CTPAT, which was a Homeland Security counterterrorism, it came out, I want to say a few years ago, but there are others as well. So I'm seeing these vendor-specific incorporate the SR, the security component, and general quality management in their requirements. And I think a better way to look at it might be, our office had put this together, and this is one of my favorite references, but it takes the standards we were talking about, well, the guideline too, the guideline of 26000. You can see CTPAT here, you see SA8000, and it's taking a look at some of your primary, your big retailers, and it's saying, you know, which of these standards it picked and pulled from, and, you know, what are the guidelines. And I can provide anybody, if you're interested, along with a copy of the presentation, a copy of this PDF. I find it to be an interesting reference. So what does the process look like when you do find out, you know, you need to be compliant, either because it's required of who you're working with, if you want to deal with Walmart, or whether or not you're interested in moving forward with integrating some components of the SA8000, or you're doing a bigger sustainability plan and following the 26000 model. I find the process to be very similar in that if you've worked with 9001 especially. But of course there's an initial evaluation. From that, so for us, we go in and let's say in the example of somebody is wanting their supplier to be able to sell to Walmart. So we would go in, or you would have someone go in to be able to do an evaluation to say, well, based off of the Walmart criteria or the SA, whatever the criteria is, here's what they're looking like, here's where the gaps are, developing that improvement plan and saying, okay, well, these are the things you're going to have to work on in order to be compliant. In the case of Walmart or Home Depot, you might have, unannounced auditors showing up to be able to confirm that as well. And then really you want to be sure to focus on the ongoing evaluation of those action items, because even if you pass, you get everyone to pass and you're good for that 1 year, it's going to come up again. So it's much less expensive and much less time consuming to be able to make sure that they're compliant throughout that period, rather than finding out you're going to have an unannounced audit and trying to rush and make sure that they've done everything over the past X number of months. So for the initial evaluation, a sample agenda might look like this, which is very, very familiar to those of you who are auditors or working with 9001 or whatever. You're doing your opening meeting, you're going on that tour. One thing that's different that I've noticed with the social audits, of course, is that access to the dormitories, to the kitchen areas. So you're kind of getting into some different areas you might not be. I'm looking at the different checklists. You're doing the interviews, you're confirming, closing. Here's what your checklist might look like. And again, that follows the standard. So if you're following the Walmart, it's going to look different than SA8000, but basically you're asking these questions. It attaches to compliance with whatever local law. So for example, if I'm doing a social audit in China, I'm going to need to follow the local laws there, and even more so in certain areas, they're different depending on industries. So it does help to have some inside information there in terms of the regulations, whether or not they're following it, and then being able to determine those findings and determining if those are compliant, whether they're non-conforming, or whether they do require improvement. So within the improvement plan, it looks very similar to your standards that you've been working with. You're going to reference where the nonconformance or the needing improvement is. You're going to identify what the corrective action is, what's required. You're going to track the history of that. And of course, there are many deadline dates, especially if you're dealing with the Walmarts or other retail vendor compliance. You'll have specific dates you have to meet. So that improvement plan should be on, a fairly specific schedule, and as to whether or not those are open and closed. And for us, we're always looking for that ongoing evaluation. So we have milestones set. So we know that we've got this many open nonconformances here. We know that through these major milestone periods, this is what it should look like. And we're able to say, okay, we expect that this supplier on a specific date is going to be compliant and be able to pass, whatever it is in question, Walmart, Lowe's, whether or not you're just trying to work with a social audit in general, when they're going to be ready for that. And I did just kind of want to show some non-compliance examples just from my last trip to China, which included the locks that I was mentioning here. And at the time, and again, the factory, when I went in, the supplier was very, very willing to assist us. Very nice. It looks super professional. Walking in, I even questioned, the client spending so much money on the program, because I thought, oh, well, this is such a big supplier, they couldn't possibly have, any non-conformances. All of these came from the supplier, in the sense that the latches, to which they claimed they didn't know why they were there, or how long they had been there, or why they would be there. We found a majority of the exits were actually locked. And of course, when we asked them questions about that, they just, they said they didn't know. Why would they be open? They didn't want people leaving without telling them. So really, that even required a basic understanding of, why would they need emergency exits to start with. This individual on the right here with the paint, you can't see it, but when I was taking this photo, he was smoking a cigarette. And, you know, when I had questioned, and there were some of these other buckets of chemicals outside of paint here on the left, just kind of dripping on the floor. And he told me, well, he told the auditor I was with that he was planning on cleaning that up later in the week, that they had just had a lot going on. But, you know, from the look of it, you could tell they hadn't cleaned up much. The most common thing that I've seen, and it's so simple, but fire extinguishers. I am not sure I've seen a social audit report come back yet where there hasn't been an issue with fire extinguishers or something like that. So lots of different non-compliances. And I guess one thing I want to end with is, you know, this whole journey really started with me back in 96, I want to say 96, and I had attended one of the first Social Accountability International conferences that they had out in New York. And former Labor Secretary Larry Reich he was going to take us on a tour. So anyways, you have these preconceived notions that, okay, well, all of these problems certainly must happen in places like Bangladesh or China. And of course, that's where we get the most requests for us to do these types of audits or solutions. But that one kind of experience, he walked us down the fabric district, the design district in New York, where they do all the textiles and everything. And it was late, and you could see up the top, and he pointed out, he said, you would be surprised by the number of labor violations that take place right here. And he kind of went on to describe exactly what I've described to you guys that I see abroad. But it should be noted, that those issues just aren't in those places. And that supplier social responsibility, especially when we're talking about, on-site at the people making our goods, it's something that we need to be cautious of, not only from that business case, but in general, kind of where things are moving and how compliant we need to be in the future. So I kind of went through that a little bit quickly, which is good because I wanted to be able to answer questions, and I did notice that a couple had come through. I had asked normal because of the way I'm sharing my screen, I'm unable to see your questions. So if you could kind of help me facilitate that process, I would be happy to discuss this further.
33. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Jennifer. We're going to take a look back through here and see if we can find if we got questions.
And while you're looking, Norval, let me add too, I'm going to put a shameless plug-in for ASQ's Social Responsibility Technical Community.
Sure.
Find us on LinkedIn, but we are a group. We just formed maybe, I think it was 2015. There's a solid group of us really with a diverse experience from healthcare to suppliers to software, but we're all really wanting to, further communicate, spread the word, and make a difference here where social responsibility is concerned. So we currently manage our members on LinkedIn. I mean, that will be transferred over to MySQ eventually. But we do encourage you to join and to let us know maybe what you're doing in your sections or divisions or at work. So we can kind of take that and cater the information that we're sharing with members and others to be able to, really get to what you need.
Okay, Jennifer, it looks like the first question we have is, well, it just disappeared on me. Hold on here just a second. Where can we get some social responsibility or checklists or questionnaires for our suppliers?
Yes, so I actually have several examples. So if you would be able to email me, and it's right here, but I have examples from checklists for Walmart, a bunch of other retailers that you can see, the F8000. So everything I've talked about today, I've got a template or checklist or example report that I would love to share.
Okay. Next question, someone says they're curious, 80% of consumers state that they would switch to a brand with better social responsibility. Do we see this percentage play out in terms of real market share?
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is when I used to teach this topic years ago at the community college, I could proudly say that it was a differentiator in the market. But now it really does seem like so many organizations are kind of forced to do it as a standard that you don't see them as much, standing out for that purpose, unless it's a company like Lush or I think Stonyfield Yogurt, they've written case studies on this. But in terms of market share, I would actually need to take a closer look at the specific industry there and whether or not we're defining that in terms of niche markets. Because you do still have a handful where SR is a differentiator, and then you have others like the big guys like Apple, where they're kind of, their stakeholders demand it, so they have much more formal reports. Because of their percent of market share naturally, their stakeholders require it more so. They're more accountable on that side.
Okay, next question we have is, how might one pitch the idea of social responsibility to senior leadership, and what are some simple first steps?
That's one of my favorite questions because I started out in marketing, and my job was to basically sell these social audits. And back in the day, that was really hard. Because when you talk to the executives and when you talk to the key decision makers, everyone agreed that social responsibility felt good. It would look great when they told people about it, but it just wasn't in their budget. You would hear things like, we have other priorities right now. We're fighting other fires. That might be something we're going to consider in the future. And, those are all fine responses. However, I had to really changed the way I communicated, and I no longer talk about those kind of more softer benefits. So I really walk in with the business case, not only for sustainability as this nice thing to have, but the very tangible benefits related to incorporating it into your long-term strategy. But not only being able to identify the financial outperformance, just in terms of the effect on your labor pool with less turnover, better recruitment, et cetera. I try to really stay focused on those tangible business case items when I start that conversation, because I've never met anyone that didn't agree that it was a good thing and that it would be great to do, but I started making progress in getting people to really take action when I shifted that conversation to talk more money. So it's very interesting because I started out with everything saying, oh, Milton Friedman was so wrong, saying that, the primary purpose of a business is to generate a profit. And I mean, he was right, and the triple bottom line is right, but you have to think about who your target audience is when you communicate this message. And, you've got to walk that fine line between profit is still obviously a primary consideration, and we have to talk to that point. So I would start there on the monetary case.
Okay, the next question we have, is there any literature you could recommend in this area?
Oh, absolutely. Oh my gosh. And that depends even on whatever industry you're in. But several books written even by one of our SRTC group members, Holly Duckworth. She's got some great stuff on sustainability. SA8000 even has some great literature in terms of guidance documentation that you can apply either in general or more specific. Industries such as the electronics industry, they have their own information out there in terms of how SR applies specifically to that industry. And then, of course, I did mention, which is more of a very general look at, but that's that Pathways to Social Responsibility. It was a little booklet that I used to pick up at World Quality, but I don't remember how many years they did it. I want to say like 4 to 6. But you would find these pamphlets. You can Google them now, and it's different case studies and how they implemented what they did. General but good stuff to give you some idea generation. And then there is one, and it's a workbook. It's the corporate sustainability. It's this green book, the workbook. What I will do, Norval, is I will put together a list of recommended reading, because I do have quite a bit, and I would include it with the presentation materials, if that would work out okay. That way people could pick based off of what they're looking for.
Sure, that'd be great.
Yeah, because there's a lot out there, and I highly encourage you. And some of it's just not even reading the basics. There's some really good books out there that take you from your idea through to your plan, help you develop your plan, outline it all the way through to kind of, how do you ensure that you've achieved the results you want. Good stuff.
Okay, well, we'll move on to the next question. What are some examples of companies with the best social responsibility? You have mentioned Walmart, Apple. Are there any others?
Well, so you do have these niche organizations that are, excellent models. For example, Lush, which is like a cosmetics company, and they've built their whole marketing on social responsibility. But honestly, when I look at examples, I still go back to Walmart, and some people may even kind of be smiling when I say that because I was one of the individuals that started out in this industry, and Walmart had a terrible reputation in terms of how they treated their suppliers and in terms of how they did business in general. And I have watched them over these 19 years. I have really seen them attack these problems from environmental packaging to the social responsibility on site. They've really led the way and created this framework to be able to take what you need, ensure it for the business case, but also appeal to these stakeholders. One of them that's really historic would be Levi Strauss. So they were one of the first, actually. They did not want to even source abroad. They felt like there were too many labor violations and too many social responsibility issues. When all their competitors were going overseas for manufacturing, they really held out. And eventually, of course, they had to because they couldn't compete anymore in the market that it was in. So they actually developed their own guidelines in terms of, hey, if we're going to do this, if we're going to source overseas in this respect, we're going to have these suppliers follow these specific SR guidelines, and we're going to do this. Mattel, in terms of the toy industry, they did the same thing. Nike, of course, is one of the major leaders. And then Apple, I love the Apple example because before Foxconn, many of us felt like they were already very socially responsible, and we loved Apple. But Foxconn hit, and I think they really identified some areas for improvement and rehauled, especially in terms of their supplier management, how they ensure that. And I find the reports that they post to be so informative in terms of what they did, how successful that was. So I always read those reports for some insight as well.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. Do other countries all have individual regulations, or are there leading international requirements that are widely accepted in addition to SA8000?
So, and I think that's one of the major reasons why ISO really couldn't say we're going to be able to issue a standard, and they just did a guideline. At least I know it was one of the things that were in consideration there, is that there are so many different, with all the countries, they do have different requirements. And just kind of one example is pregnancy requirements. We were in the Dominican Republic years ago for one of our first, and our client did not like that we had noted they have forced pregnancy testing. Well, in that country, that was acceptable. So although our client had an issue with forcing women there to do that, it was allowed within that country. Now, if you were to do that same audit in another country, it's not going to be allowed. So it was decided that in order to have the biggest result, you really do have to go in and follow, that country's requirements. But at some level too, there's a communication that can go back and forth. But for a guideline, now there is one which was, I think it was MS 1000, and it was a British standard, and it recently came up. So I am looking further into that one. MSS 1000, I believe it was. That's a voluntary international standard that was created by some of the individuals from CQI Integrated Management, I believe. So that's one that's kind of coming about. But to answer that question, there's no definitive standard yet.
Okay. Moving on, what percentage of companies have a responsible sourcing agreement, a voluntary commitment by the company to take into account their suppliers' social responsibility, as Walmart and Nike did?
Normal, can you read the beginning of that question for me one more time?
Sure. What percentage of companies have a responsible sourcing agreement, a voluntary commitment by the company to take into account their suppliers' social responsibility, as Walmart and Nike did?
I actually don't know the answer to that, but I just actually took a note to try to look into to get a better answer. I don't want to put a wrong number out there. In terms of my experience, my own experience with clients over the past however many years, formal agreements really come from the larger organizations. So we are able to, in speaking with them, when they ask us to go in and do, for example, let's say I got a company calling and they're looking at a new supplier in Vietnam. Well, they want us to go in and check out that supplier for, general QMS stuff, just to make sure, they're legit, they're going to be able, they are what they say, et cetera. We're able to say, hey, how about putting in, some of these social SR elements into that, to kind of add on. And that's a discussion, but I can't say that unless it's really kind of a larger company, they have a formal type of agreement with the supplier. And I'm hoping to see that kind of change. But I would like to be able to go back and maybe look into that question more to give you a better answer.
Okay. I know who asked the question. Is it okay for me to just let you know who that is?
Please do, because I actually think I have an individual I can reach out to that would be able to give us a good, some good feedback there. So I'd love to share that.
Okay, great. We'll go ahead and move on to the next question here. Besides the big corporation flow down and adoption of social responsibility, are there any groups or associations assisting small to medium-sized businesses to start defining social responsibility standards?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So most industries, from electronics to textiles, they all kind of have their own overseeing association that kind of gives some insight there. But what I do love about SA8000 is that it's all offered for free of charge. So you've got guideline documentations, some training documents are available. So I really find that to be a good source of information that's no charge. That covers various industries. But most of the industries I've dealt with also have their own, for example, the Fair Labor Association I mentioned earlier. And then all of them, not only they use the big members, what I've found is they will leverage the big members to be able to offer programs to reach out to smaller organizations. And I'll even give a shameless plug out to Holly Duckworth in the Sherpa Institute, but she's a member of the SRTC, but they also even have a small consulting group where they're offering sustainability program for you to be able to be a sustainability consultant. And one of your projects really is to kind of take your organization through that process. And their whole model is based off the 26,000. So, I mean, there's them, and I'm sure there are others. But they're great, and any industry association would also be able to guide you to resources as well.
Okay, well, we'll move on here. How long is the preparation for an initial evaluation? For example, reading all the supplier's written procedures, et cetera.
And that varies. So in our case, when we find out a social audit's required, we'll reach out to that supplier, and we do request a lot of information in advance. The profile, they have a questionnaire. So that's it. We're able to really determine how much time when we get there or how organized they're going to be. And I've seen it both ways. We've gone into suppliers that really had nothing, and they had no paperwork, no documentation. You're kind of starting from scratch. That's a big project. But if they've sold to any of the retailers before, or they've got a handful of clients, usually they've got all of that ready, where you walk in and it's all very organized for that initial meeting. And I've seen them say, okay, well, we're going to need to see this, and the individual is able to kind of go to that and show them, and then they cross-reference it later. So I guess the key there is we try to figure out how much time it's going to take by preparing in advance. One time when they had nothing, we were there for, I'm going to say, almost 4 hours because it was from the time we got there until after lunch. really just trying to decipher, organize, and go through, what they had. And we ended up having to extend the audit in that case, for another day just because of the prep work took so long. So the key there is we really do try to get them as organized as possible in advance.
Okay. Right now, it looks like that was the last question. We still have approximately a little under 7 minutes to go before the top of the hour. So if anybody else has questions that they would like to ask Jennifer, we still have time for her to take your questions. And while we're waiting, as people may be typing in a question to the chat box, reminder that in 1 week from today will be our first March webinar, which will be managing your internal audit program. That will be with Kristen Case of Case Consults. It'll be 12 noon Eastern time next Tuesday, so hopefully many of you who are online with us today can also join us for that webinar next week. As we patiently wait to see if there are any other questions, we do have a few minutes left, like I said. It does not look like we're getting any more questions. So, Jennifer, any other last comments?
No, but what I would like to do when you put these materials up, what I'll do is I'll get some of those templates together, and I'll share this matrix, and I will actually put together just a brief list of the primary associations I've worked with in different industries as a reference sheet, in addition to that recommended reading. It's such a broad topic. I think at this point, it is where you kind of get a little bit more specific. So I will put those kind of resources out there, and then I'm happy to answer any other questions. I think I even have a little video that we put together, related to this topic as well that might be useful to some.
Okay, great. We can include that in our follow-up information that we will share here with folks, hopefully here this afternoon, so that way we can find out how things went, as well as share the link to the recording for today in case somebody would like to go back and view portions of this again, or if they came online a little bit late, they can certainly go back and see what they might have missed. Looks like there's no other questions coming in, Jennifer.
I sincerely appreciate everyone's time, more so the interest in this topic, and I do hope to hear from others with any questions or anything with the materials, and I hope you find them useful.
Great. Well, thank you for your time today with us, Jennifer. We really appreciate your willingness to give this talk on a very important topic.
Thank you, Norval.
And I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us today. Until next Tuesday, 12 noon Eastern time, we'd like to wish everybody a good rest of the day, and we'll hopefully see you next week. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.